Good evening, everybody. For those that don't know me, I'm Ian Wise. So I've got the pleasure this evening of introducing our speaker, Professor Tim Lenton from Exeter University, where he is the chair of the Climate Change and Earth System Science Department. I think it's a department or faculty or whatever it is. It's a very grand-sounding name, Climate Change and Earth System Science. Tim tells me that he's been working in this area for all his adult life, so this isn't just a fad that's come with the fashion in recent years. He spent his entire adult life in the field of climate change, widely published, co-authored many papers that are peer-reviewed and very widely respected in the climate science world. You can see from the slide his talk tonight, Tipping Points of Our Living Planet, which itself invites lots of questions. Plainly not one tipping point, but seemingly more than one, hence the plural. And begs the difficult question about what we're going to do about it if we are at a tipping point. So perhaps to answer those questions and illuminate us more, I can hand over to Professor Tim Lenton.
Thanks, Ian. Nice to meet you all. Before we get into the slides, yes, I could have called it Positive Tipping Points to Avoid Climate Tipping Points. I'll try and explain what that means as we go along. But yeah, before we get into the slides, if it was normal chairs you were sat on, I'd encourage you all to lean back so we can get our brain onto the idea of a tipping point, because we all know that, you know, if you only lean back a little bit, there's plenty of force that wants to restore you back to your original stable state upright on the chair. But if you lean back a bit further, suddenly those restoring forces get weaker, don't they? And at some point, there's a kind of balancing point where it's a little nudge one way or the other that makes a big difference. Oh, that worked out well. We ended up back in the state we started in, but you know, if a fly, as a friend of mine says, if a fly shits on the chair, it might go the other way. And you might end up in a different stable state, sprawled on your back on the floor. A classic tipping point where a small nudge or a small change makes a big difference to the outcome of you in the chair. But we're going to talk about big things, tipping points in the planet, in the Earth's climate. And then to cheer you up, after a bit of a misery fest, we're going to talk about tipping points in society that could accelerate the change we need so that we don't end up in the climate crisis, Armageddon, or whatever you prefer to call it. So this is just a little toy model of, it could be any kind of system. Maybe it's the Greenland ice sheet, or maybe it's the economy, and it's in the state in the left, like chair upright. But I'm forcing the system. I'm pushing it in a way that makes the state it started in less stable. It's a bit like having woodworm on the back of the legs of the chair, gnawing through it until being upright becomes unstable. And at some point, the system will tip kind of abruptly, and we say irreversibly, into the other state. Now, before it does that, there's actually a few telltale early warning signals, just like when you lean back on the chair. If you're near the tipping point, everything slows down. You don't recover so well from the little shocks. And what's going on in a system when you're heading towards the tipping point? Engineers talk about feedback, and they would say, if a system has a stable state like sitting upright on the chair, it's like there's some balancing or negative feedback, they call it, which is trying to restore the status quo, political or otherwise. But when you get to a tipping point, there are these other kinds of feedback that amplify a little change and make it bigger, and then amplify it more and make it even bigger. And it's that kind of feedback that takes over at the tipping point. Okay, now the climate. I expect you all have a sense that the climate is changing. And this is a lot of wiggly lines, but the red line is last year, 2023, and it's going through the year on each of the plots. And it's a few important things. It's the temperature of the North Atlantic Ocean, so all that big ocean beside us. It's the whole world ocean surface temperature It's the whole world's surface temperature. Oh, and this happens to be the area of forest burnt in Canada. All the black and grey lines are all the previous 22 years of the millennium and a few from the 1990s, I think. But look what the red line was doing last year. Crazy stuff, way outside the range of natural or recent variability. So something's going on in the climate and was going on in a big way last year. It was as if if you watch the ball rolling around before, it's as like the ball did some very unusual large deviations. These might just be, we hope these are just extremes. We hope they have something to do with the El Nino that's been building. But it's really extraordinary deviations of the ball. And we hope these are just events. In other words, things roll back. But what I want to talk about tonight is the cases where it won't roll back. The big bits of the climate that really can be tipped into another state, and then it's really hard to get back. How fast they tip, it's not always as fast as the chair falls over. It depends on the system. So ice sheets, they're sluggish things. They move slowly, but they can be tipped to disappear. The Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, and some more. Bits of the living planet, like the Amazon rainforest, unfortunately, could be tipped to be lost and to be replaced by a savanna. That would probably unfold over something like a decade, so a sort of human timescale. And then if we were to tip, say, the monsoon in West Africa, that's a really fast system. That could be there one year and disappeared the next. That would be horrendous. So that's because the atmosphere is a very fast responding system. This map we drew up 15 years ago now to begin to map out things that could be tipped, and one thing that already tipped in my lifetime. It was one of the things that motivated me as a student to get into the work I do, which was we saw the Antarctic ozone hole was discovered, and then we set about trying to slowly repair it. Now, the important thing to know, in a spirit of assessing risks, because each of these tipping points I'm talking about would have major impacts for us as well as for other living things that kind of are our life support system. The important thing to know that I tried to summarize here is every time scientists in this area, climate science, get together and they assess how close are these tipping points, every time they do it over time, they conclude, oh, they're bigger and they're closer than we thought they were when we looked last time. And that's what the yellow to red colors are. So we've got the temperature of the planet. We're about here at the moment, above what's called the pre-industrial level. But before we started burning all those fossil fuels in the Industrial Revolution, that's where we set the zero line. Now we're already 1.2 degrees C warmer. But unfortunately, every time we assess it, we think our assessment of the likelihood of passing these big tipping points goes up, or it comes down in temperature towards, whilst we push the temperature up. The simple version of that is we're in the danger zone now. We already think we're at risk of crossing some big tipping points with big implications. So which ones? Why do we think that? Well, we do a variety of things in my world of the science. We make models of the complicated climate. They're like elaborate weather forecasting models, but they run over the rest of this century or whatever. And we call it force the models, just like leaning back on the chair. We plug into the model, well, maybe humans will burn this much fossil fuels at this rate, or maybe they'll do that, or maybe they'll do the other. Anyway, the long and the short of it, this map shows that, in those model worlds, sometimes abrupt changes or tipping points happen, and it shows with the little coloured symbols where they happen. And the models don't capture everything. These are models that don't even have the ice sheets in them, and they often don't have the biosphere, the living stuff. But they for sure have the ocean circulation, and they have the sea ice, and they have the land surface, and they find often there are tipping points of the circulation of the North Atlantic Ocean up here and here. We'll come back to that, but if those ones go, that can fundamentally change the climate right where we are in the UK, for example. And a load of other ones, actually, sometimes they do have the Amazon in the model, and sometimes it tips away. And the temperature at which tipping can happen, well, we're here somewhere in the yellow, and sometimes in the model, things that haven't happened in reality have already happened in the model. It tipped at a lower temperature, but certainly where we are in the yellow looks risky because lots of tipping points happen in these complex models. Then you have these systems like Antarctica, the great ice sheets. We don't tend to put them in the model with the rest of the climate, but we will kind of we'll force, as we say, a model of Antarctica with a warming scenario and see what happens. And I'm going to show you what happens as we dial the temperature up and we give Antarctica as long as it needs for change to respond to any given temperature. So I said Antarctica is very sluggish. It takes a long time to melt. But we're just going to dial the temperature up. Don't worry if you can't read it. We're now at about 1 degree C, and quite a lot of West Antarctica just went. We're going to 2 degrees C, and West Antarctica largely disappears. In the long run, that is. And that's 3.5 meters of sea level rise in the long run. That's irreversible. We're now up at about 4 degrees C, and we lost the Wilkes Basin in East Antarctica. That's another 3 or 4 meters of sea level rise committed in the long run. There's another basin somewhere over there. That one's going, or that one's going. We get to 7 degrees C, let's hope we don't go there. Boom, then the East Antarctic ice sheet melts. That's 54 meters of sea level rise, and that's the whole coasts of the world are completely redrawn, billions of people are underwater, etc. Well, hopefully we're going nowhere near 7 degrees of global warming, but we are currently on a trajectory later this century to be around 2.5 to 3 degrees of warming. So we might make a commitment to lose we might be about to make a commitment to lose the West Antarctic ice sheet, and at least commit our descendants to a very different coastline of the world. Well, those are models, and we don't, even those of us who make the models and run the models know that they have flaws. But as scientists, we always think evidence is king. So we go out and actually look at the changes happening in the real climate, in the real Earth. And we don't have to talk about everything on the map for you to see that there are some striking changes that are unfolding, that are accelerating. So the Greenland ice sheet has been busy shrinking at an accelerating rate. That West Antarctic ice sheet we were just looking at, that we can't rule out that unfortunately that part of it has already crossed the tipping point because the glaciers are retreating in a way that's self-propelling. It's part of the ice sheet that drains enough ice to raise the sea levels worldwide by over 1 meter. So that might be on the way already. The Amazon suffered extraordinary droughts last year and has been doing for the last 15 years or so that are killing the trees directly through the drought, but also through fires that burn them down. So that's at risk. And then there's this thing, the Atlantic circulation, the great overturning circulation we call it, that drags heat from the southern hemisphere into the northern hemisphere and gives us the nice mild climate we enjoy in the UK with the Gulf Stream and everything else. Unfortunately, that slowed down about 15% in the last half century, and we do think that that's at risk of tipping, and we're trying to work out how close that could be. So all of this is how we then draw up a revised couple of maps. These are the bits of the planet, I call them the tipping elements, that if we tip them, we think we could tip them, and if we did, everyone would know about it. It would change the whole climate. It would either raise the sea levels a massive amount, as we've talked about, or just reorganize the whole pattern of the weather in simple terms. So if we have a tipping point of this thing here, deep convection it's called in the Labrador Sea. It sounds very esoteric, but it's basically water sinking from the top of the ocean to the bottom, somewhere on the west or south side of Greenland. Last time that tipped, that caused the transition from what's called the medieval warm period to the Little Ice Age in Europe. So can you picture the Dutch masters' paintings of great snowy landscapes, be they in the Low Countries of the Netherlands or Belgium or whatever? We have that tipping point again now. Well, the world's warmer, but it would still cause extraordinarily severe and snowy winters here, but perversely it would make the summers hotter and those heat waves in summer more persistent. So the seasonality would just go up on both ends of the scale. Is our infrastructure in the UK built for that? No, it is not. So that one will be big news, and I stress it because that one can happen at near the present temperature in some of the best models that we have, and it unfolds in a decade. So in 2033 or whatever, if that one happens today, we'll really know about it. We'll know about it before then. Okay, then there's a load of things that maybe if you tip them, it doesn't change the whole climate, but people care about it because these things, tropical coral reefs, 500 million people depend on those for their livelihoods. So tip those, and you may be aware that there are these extraordinary so-called bleaching events that are killing coral reefs around the tropics. Tip those, And not only does the coral care about it, but a lot of people will care about it. Oh, and if the monsoon in West Africa, we tip that, well, that's, again, probably 500 million people's livelihoods in the Sahel. Okay, so there's a lot of information here, but this is our latest summary of where is the tipping point. We're not quite sure, hence the yellow to red scale, but the dotted line is the best guess for each of the different things. This is the warming level. This is where we are on that line there. That's where we're going later this century with a big uncertainty range on current policies, as they're called. And you see that we think that a couple of the big ice sheets, we're really at risk of tipping them at 1.5 degrees of global warming, plus those coral reefs, plus a big chunk of the frozen soils of the north, which when they thaw abruptly release methane and carbon dioxide, both of them greenhouse gases to the atmosphere and add to the warming, and so on. And of course the risk just goes up the more we heat the planet up. And it gets worse, I'm afraid, before it gets better, because it's like the human body. If you have a major disruption or problem in one organ, there are probably going to be ramifications for the other organs. So if you tip one bit of the climate, it has implications for other bits, and sometimes it's like you line the dominoes up, you tip one over and it could tip the next and so on. That's the worst case scenario. Hopefully it's not quite that bad, but we already know that the Arctic's warming 3 or 4 times as fast as the rest of the planet. It's for a really simple reason. You melt a really reflective white ice surface on top of the ocean, sea ice. You replace it with a really dark blue ocean that absorbs way more sunlight, that heats it up way more. Well, that Arctic warming is doing a couple of things. It's melting the Greenland ice sheet, and that's a great big lump of fresh water, pouring fresh water into the Atlantic Ocean. But then when it warms the Arctic, it also rains and snows more because the air holds more moisture. And that's also fresh water coming out of the sky in simple terms. Extra fresh water pouring into the North Atlantic disrupts that thing I talked about before. The water that sinks from the top of the ocean to the bottom does so because it gets dense enough to sink. That means it gets cold or salty enough to sink all the way to the bottom. If you add fresh water at the top, it doesn't get dense enough to sink. You break that process, you break this thing, or you slow down this thing, the great Atlantic overturning. More on that in a minute, because if that gets seriously disrupted, well, not only do we have cooling and drying in this part of the world, it will disrupt the monsoons all around the tropics. It will leave heat behind in the Southern Ocean, and that will accelerate the melting of the ice sheets there. So we'll just look at that in a bit more detail, just to ram the point home. If we cross that tipping point, on top of the 2.5 degrees of warming that we might be getting later this century, this is the sort of pattern of temperature change we might get. Blue, it gets colder. Red, it still gets warmer. This is the pattern of rainfall change. Blue, it gets wetter. Red, it gets drier. This is the most alarming one. It gets a whole lot drier all across Europe, all across the monsoon region here, all across the Amazon, all across the Indian monsoon region. Not drier a little bit. This scale is a maximum of 100%. I mean, it's the end of all rainfall in the heart of the red area there. But, you're talking about halving of rainfall in India, things like that. So that's major ramifications. So I know there's a lot of pictures here, but this is now what it would do for the ability to grow 3 major staple crops, and purple is less able to grow those crops, and dark purple is you can't grow them anymore. Green is it's better, and dark green is it's way better. Well, there ain't a lot of green on the maps for wheat or maize, are there? In fact, it's mostly purple, and it's mostly dark purple. It's telling you this is a serious food security crisis if this tipping point happens, because we'll more than halve the viable area to grow wheat or maize, 2 of the most important staple crops worldwide. So we'll be in serious trouble. There'll be a water crisis with it. Well, that is enough about the bad news. It should have rammed the point home that we're running really severe risks changing the climate. It's not going to be a smooth transition into some other climate state. And if we cross some of those tipping points, well, I'll let you make up your own horror stories of how it'll play out. But we should be doing everything in our power to limit that risk, would be my simple common sense message to you. So then you've got to ask the question, what does that mean? What does it mean to try and stop climate change in its tracks? It's very simple, actually. At the bottom line, it means stop emitting the greenhouse gases that cause the climate change. Most of those come from burning fossil fuels. So in simple terms, it means stop burning all fossil fuels. It also means stop changing the land, probably means some changes in what our food systems are, how we eat and things like that. We'll come to that. How soon do we have to stop burning the fossil fuels and stop emitting the greenhouse gases? Well, if we wanted to limit temperature, global warming, to around 1.5 degrees C, which is the very best we could hope for now, with a 50-50 chance, which isn't great odds, we have to stop all the fossil fuel burning and all the other greenhouse gas emissions within a generation by 2050, probably before. We have to go down something like the red line. Currently, we've been going up the green line of global greenhouse gas emissions, and it wibbles around a bit, and we can't tell whether emissions are stable or not at the moment. But for sure, they're not coming down yet, and they're going to have to come down very, very sharply. People in this area talk about decarbonizing the economy, which is a sort of fancy way of saying how can we stop the fossil fuel powering of the economy or the fossil fuel burning? How fast are we doing that, and are we doing it fast enough? Well, we're doing some of it, but not nearly fast enough. We need to go about 7 times faster globally at decarbonizing the economy. That's a spectacular rate of acceleration. And my argument to you tonight is there's no incremental way of doing that. That's a radical change. That means we have to believe that there are some good tipping points that could become self-propelling, that could become self-accelerating, that could accelerate the shutdown of all the activities that produce the greenhouse gases. And that's what a bunch of us are arguing these days, that actually there is, we're in a state of the world and the economy and society. Let's call it business as usual state or status quo. And it is largely powered by fossil fuels, and there are particular, political economy, and we can talk about that later. There's lots of damping feedbacks that maintain the status quo. I mean, we still subsidize with our taxpayers' money fossil fuel extraction and consumption, fair enough. We do lots of things to maintain the status quo, but there's another state in which the economy would run perfectly well, in simple terms, powered by renewable energy, if we think about the energy side of it. There's definitely a hilltop to get from this state to the other. It's like chair upright. Well, in this case, I may be to take it the other way around. We're now talking about trying to tip back into a better state, in my view, but we've still got to make some effort to get to a tipping point. So what I want to talk about is, what is this about? What does it take to lower the hilltop? It means finding and triggering some reinforcing feedbacks that start propelling change in the desired direction. It probably also means doing some things that undermine what we call the damping feedbacks that maintain the status quo. I want to try and show you that social tipping is possible and that there are lots of these feedbacks we could work with. To do that, meet a distant relative of mine, Tim Lenton, as just to begin to get our thoughts on social tipping points. This photograph is taken in 1913, and there's a number on Lillian's jacket, so who knows their social history well enough to guess why Lillian is in prison in 1913 in London. Suffragette, exactly. She's one of the many brave, small group of extremely brave women suffragettes. You go to the BBC archives to listen to her. Very entertaining. She'll tell you that her intention was to burn at least 1 or was it 2 buildings a week to create a kind of intolerable situation for the government that they couldn't govern without the consent of, a majority of those being governed. Anyway, Lillian is in prison because she and Olive Worry have been caught almost red-handed burning down the tea house in Kew Gardens, as shown in that photo. In prison, Lillian goes straight on hunger strike, many of the suffragettes did. After 3 days, the prison authorities were getting frustrated. They did what they usually do, which is force feed her. They put the tube down the wrong way into one of her lungs. They poured liquid food into her lungs. What happens then to you if you have liquid food poured into your lungs? You're being drowned, basically. 1 lung only, luckily. So she didn't die. But obviously, a traumatic experience apparently took 7 people to restrain her. She was then discreetly released from prison to the care of her friends. And the Home Secretary proceeded to say that the reason she was unwell was purely because of a hunger strike. Well, a national outcry ensued in the pages of the Times and other reputable newspapers as it became obvious that the Home Secretary was lying, and doctors and members of the establishment came to Lillian's cause, if you like, here. Well, this is one of many extraordinary events in that time that started shifting public opinion away from the government's position, away from the social norm of the time and towards universal suffrage. And of course it took the First World War and it took a lot of things to eventually reach the tipping point, but many of us would agree that the actions of a small group of people ultimately made a profound change for all of us and the nature of our democracy. So major social tipping point, obviously. So we can have social tipping points, we can change our norms. Maybe we can change our norms from it's fine to just keep burning those fossil fuels to actually know, a bit like smoking in public, maybe that will become something that isn't the norm anymore. Anyway, there's a few people who would like to change the norms, and they're demonstrating some principles of amplifying feedback, and Greta Thunberg is a great example. So she starts her protest outside the Swedish parliament as she skips school on a Friday to protest that the government should do more on climate change. What does that do? It makes it just incrementally easier for the next person to upset their parents and upset the state by skipping school and joining her. Who makes it incrementally easier for the next person to do the same and join? And that's a reinforcing feedback. That's an amplifying feedback cycle right there. So more and more people join. The population of people protesting doubled about once a week in the Fridays for Future protest. And if you understand exponential growth, which frankly most people don't, and I have to try and teach it to my class, if you keep doubling from one person every week and you carry on for 7 months, how many people do you think you've got in the protest? About 1 million. And that's exactly what there were after about 7 months. There were 1 million people, at least 1 million people worldwide protesting for more decisive action on climate change. And of course, governments quite rapidly responded by declaring climate and ecological emergencies. This is the European Parliament doing so in May 2019. Greta started her protest in late August 2018. Quite a fast response. Problem is, climate can't hear political declarations. Climate can only feel a change in the greenhouse gas emissions from human activities. So we've got to have more than just political intent here. We've actually got to have action in all its forms, political, social. There's technology behind this action. So we need to believe that we can tip those things that cause the emissions, which is going to come down to some other things we've got to think about, technology and so on. So let's just start to go in that direction by thinking about what's going on at heart in the dynamics of a protest movement and the way it can have a tipping point. Well, it's called by academics social contagion. At the very simplest level, we sometimes follow what other people do. We often follow what our neighbors do. Sometimes it's just simple imitation. Sometimes it's a bit more sophisticated, like a political movement. But it's through various forms of social contagion that ideas can spread rapidly, as well as protest movements, but also sometimes technologies. So it turns out that there's social contagion in the uptake of solar panels on people's roofs, robustly evidenced in Germany and the US over recent 10, 15, 20 years even now. This is a little movie. It's going to spool around. It's a part of Colorado in the US. The yellows are the first-time customers. The greens are referred by their friends. You just look at it, if you can see it. It's a bit hard in the light, but you get already a sense, oh, this is like exponential growth, and this is spreading, and it's spreading because people are sort of learning from each other. Classic, what's called diffusion of innovation with tipping point dynamics. Great. Because we are going to need some more tipping points like that to clean technologies. So we've got to be sure that it's possible to tip a change in technology quickly. And here is a classic historical example to try and demonstrate that. So now we rewind to the year 1900, This is Fifth Avenue, New York City, on the day of the Easter parade, where Fifth Avenue, it's a posh part of town, all the rich people go out and parade in their finest clothes on the sidewalk, as they call it over there, or in their horse-drawn carriage in 1900, as you see. But one person is in an early automobile. Can you see the one person in the early automobile, or is it too hard from where you are? In the middle, over there. Yeah. Right. Now we're going to fast forward 13 years. We're going to the actually the year that Lillian has just got out of prison and is recuperating with her friends. And go across the Atlantic, look at the Easter parade, Fifth Avenue, New York City. Oh, everybody is in an automobile except one person left in a horse-drawn carriage. Can you see them? They're in the same bit of the street coming towards us over there. Wow, that's a tipping point, isn't it, in how people got around? And of course it went to the rich people first, the adoption of cars, but then it spread out to the middle classes, and then it spread out to the working classes, and it changed everything. I mean, it changed streets from being a place for the people and for the kids to play in to being ruled by the automobile. It has all kinds of irreversible ramifications. One of my favorite tidbits of knowledge is that in this interval between 1900 and 1913, there's a time when over a third of the early cars are battery electric. And Henry Ford is a huge enthusiast for the battery electric car, and his wife drove around in one, and he worked with Thomas Edison to bring an electric car to market. But unfortunately, his Model T Ford was, of course, winning the day already by that time because of some amplifying feedbacks that really propelled the uptake of the first car, the Model T in particular. And what were they? Well, there are things we call learning by doing. In this case, the more cars we made, the better we got at making them. But that applies to a whole bunch of technologies in general. Economies of scale. The bigger the Model T production line, the cheaper the next Model T was to make. And it came down in price spectacularly, by the way. But that's true across technologies as a rule, and is super important. And then there's something we call technological reinforcement, which is sort of a fancy way of saying, if you have a new technology, people get inventive and they come up with other technologies that make the original technology more useful. And in this case, cars come along, gas stations have to be invented and a network of those are needed. And then you need harder road surfaces, so we better go out and make the better roads and so on. This is all like feedback reinforcing technologies. That's history, of course, but the point is we're starting to see these tipping points happen, and we're even seeing them in the car sector. So this is the data for Norway. Blue is battery electric vehicles. We're going from 1990 to 2023 here. 2010, brown is petrol or diesel. That's diesel, that dark brown is petrol. 2010, it's all petrol or diesel cars. Then a little sliver of battery electric vehicles sneak onto the market in 2011, and then every year the sales of battery electric vehicles double year on year on year on year, and within a decade, boom, the market's completely taken over by the battery electric vehicle in Norway. Why Norway? Crazy, right? It's a cold place. The batteries don't function as well in the cold. Well, there are other good things. The electricity is really cheap there because it's nearly 100% hydroelectric and has been for decades. But actually, it's social activists who are responsible for the fact that Norway is nearly a decade ahead of the rest of the world in tipping to electric vehicles. So remember Lillian? These aren't suffragettes. These are members of a famous pop band, Morten Harket of the band a-ha. His architecture friend Harold and an environmentalist friend Frederick. They were the people who actually came up with a series of policy demands to the Norwegian government to incentivize the transition to electric vehicles in 1989 when they're photographed here. The Prime Minister of Norway at the time, Gro Harlem Brundtland, famous for the Brundtland Commission on Sustainable Development, but in their eyes, at least, a hypocrite, because she had gone back to Norway as Prime Minister and was increasing the extraction and the export of oil and gas to the rest of the world whilst preaching sustainable development. And they didn't like that, nor would I. And they called her bluff, or they called the government's bluff and said, we're a rich country, electric cars are available, we should incentivize them. This is a hobby converted electric car, a Fiat Panda, right? but converted to electric, stated range 45 kilometers, I think. So the next year they imported a vehicle just like this, and they were demanding that the import registration tax be waived, that road tolls be waived, that the VAT be waived, that ferries should be free for electric vehicles, that parking should be free, and so on. They got the first demand to have the import registration tax waived for their car and everyone thereafter. They fought for about 7 years to get road tolls waived for electric vehicles. Very entertaining story. They drove the car around, refused to pay the tolls, got the car impounded. It went up at auction. They turn up at the auction. They're a world-famous pop band. The media are in the front row. It's quite embarrassing for the government officials, the whole scenario. And a friend, an unknown friend apparently, buys the car back for them, gives it back to them, and they repeat the whole cycle. Brilliant. Anyway, that's how you start to create, in this case, social technological tipping point. Because as you saw, as soon as major manufacturers like Nissan put the Leaf on the market in 2011 in Norway, boom, by that time the Norwegians have been experimenting with little electric city cars for decades. They've been learning from each other, oh, these things actually work, this is quite good. They put all these policy incentives in place, and bam, they just go straight for it from then on. Now, that's just Norway. That's a trivial marketplace in the global scheme of things. But the good news is, although we're about 8 years behind, the rest of the world is very close to that tipping point. So this stacked bar chart is the global fleet of electric vehicles. What's it doing? It's growing exponentially. Every year and a half, it's doubling at the moment. All these dotted lines, they're different estimates of the price of batteries on the left-hand axis. But the point is, the price of batteries has come down spectacularly, and that's crucial to this story. The more batteries we make, the cheaper the next battery to make. Oh, and incidentally, the better the next battery is, because the range you can get out of a given mass of battery for a car has gone up by nearly a factor of 3 in the last decade, whilst the price of that battery has come down a factor of 10. And that's why now electric vehicles are becoming cost competitive to buy with petrol or diesel cars, and they're already cheaper than total ownership cost, arguably at the moment, or at least mine is by my calculation in the UK. So the reinforcing feedback's really strong. A little bit of social activism and some strong policy support can bring the tipping point forward. This is a tipping point that some of us would like to spread to the whole world, because just car driving alone is about 8% of greenhouse gas emissions. And in a rich country like ours, it's more like 15%. So it's a big deal. And we get a lesson from what happened in Norway and from the reinforcing feedbacks globally, that it's a bit of policy support, a bit of social activism. You can get the reinforcing feedbacks going, and then they start getting stronger and stronger, and the change starts getting stronger and stronger until it becomes self-propelling, right, till it tips. And that opens up the possibility that we're going to have a sort of cascade. In this case, it feels like it's just this one technology, cars, but actually it's bigger than that. So we're already seeing the more cars we make, the cheaper the more electric cars we make, the cheaper the next one to make, or rather the cheaper the battery gets. Very soon the whole global market is tipping. We think China's market in Europe has already tipped. The US is a bit behind, but it's coming. That's that sector, but the crucial thing is then you've got a load of cheap batteries that are enabling you to tip other sectors in a direction you want. So what are you going to do next? Well, we might well electrify goods transport. We've all seen the electric Amazon van arrive at the house, right? And so on and so forth. That's good, because that's another 4 or 5% of greenhouse gas emissions right there in goods transport. And then there's something else exciting going on, because as the oil firms see this tipping point to electric vehicles happening, they realize, there's that oil we thought we were going to be able to sell you at some time in the future. There's not going to be a market for it because no one's going to be driving petrol or diesel cars. Well, that's interesting. That's striking some value off their assets, stranding their assets, hurting some of our pension funds if they're badly invested, but also perhaps triggering those companies to start eventually thinking about becoming something else, not an oil company. And then there's the really big one. Cheap batteries is a really crucial enabler for the big one, the tipping point to renewable energy. The power sector, just making the electricity to shine the lights on me and power the computer and everything else, that's just over a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. But there's the tipping point to zero emission electricity, renewable, 100% renewable electricity. It's coming, as we'll see. But what do we need to get to 100% renewable electricity? We need it when we want to go out and put the kettle on for coffee in the break between the lecture and the Q&A. Is the sun shining? No. Is the wind blowing? I'm not sure, I haven't been outside, but maybe it isn't. We're going to need lots of cheap storage on the electricity grid, aren't we? And how are we going to store electricity cheaply? With all those cheap batteries that have come out of the tipping point of the electric vehicle sector. Or that's one way we can do it, one way we already are doing it. Bringing me to example number 2 of a tipping point that's happened in the power sector in our inglorious, or whatever you want to think of it, nation. This is coal burning's contribution to UK electricity supply in the black line. There in 2012, it's 40% of our power supply, and it falls off a cliff through about 2015-16, and we're over here somewhere now. But today, there's one coal-burning power station operational in the UK, and when's it going to close? In September this year, if not before. So we've shut coal burning down from 40% to zero quite quickly in a decade, if not less. These are the wedges of renewable energy. Blue is wind, yellow is solar, that's biomass. Carry on over here, if I updated my plot, you'd see renewables is now giving us at least 40% of our electricity, the 40% that coal was giving us. Offshore wind is in a tipping point of exponential growth right now. Great news for us, I would argue. How did this happen? This is pretty extraordinary, isn't it? A couple of things were going on there. One of the most important ones, though, is that the government just put a modest price on carbon emissions just in the power sector, not across anything else we do. They just said, right, utility companies, we're going to put a price on carbon in the power sector. It's going to be this, but we're going to step it up. We're never going to reduce it, and we'll step it up over time. And what did that do? Well, coal's the dirtiest form of power generation. It emits the most CO2, so it penalises coal burning. Coal burning wasn't that profitable anyway at this point. So very soon it gets to the point where investors in coal are making little or no money, and they're pulling their money out of coal burning and putting it somewhere else. Well, that is a reinforcing feedback. It brings the house of cards down, and then the utilities are left with these great big power stations that they're trying to keep ready to operate, but they're not burning any coal. That's a cost and a liability. So what do? They destroy them. This is the one in Oxfordshire, Didcot A, being destroyed. And that's an irreversible tipping point, right? You've destroyed, we can't burn coal anymore to make power, because we destroyed the massive power stations that did it. And good riddance, in my view. But we've got to look global. We need still to tip out the 36% of the world's electricity that comes from burning coal. Very similar percentage to what the UK had 10 years ago, right? So can we do that in the next 10 years? Can we tip coal out of the global economy, power production in 10 years? Well, if the UK can, why not? What's it going to take? Well, what it's going to take is the fact that solar power and wind power are now the cheapest ways of making power in most of the world. This is a plot just showing that solar panels have got cheaper and cheaper the more solar panels we made. So this is the price on a log scale of a solar PV panel, and this on the log scale is the total number of solar PV panels. And look at the spectacular drop in price. That's 2008, if you can't see it, that's 2018. That's a tenfold drop in price in a decade. The more panels you make, the cheaper the next one gets to make. Oh, and the better it is. A little bit better anyway. And this curve continues downwards. So now we march into a future where we have the cheapest electricity we've ever seen, because fossil fuel electricity has been a fairly even price for a century. We're going into a future where by the end of this decade, in some parts of the world, solar, in particular solar electricity, will be a third, maybe even a quarter, maybe even a fifth of the price that electricity has ever been. This is great news. This is great news for the 600 and something million people in sub-Saharan Africa who don't yet have access to electricity, for example. So we're kind of approaching or at the tipping point. This is from colleagues of mine, Femke, fantastic researcher in Exeter and colleagues, and it's just showing the cheapest form of new power generation where for the renewables it includes the cost of battery storage that you need alongside the panels or the wind turbines. And a blue place is where wind power is the cheapest. The sort of pucey red is where solar is the cheapest. Brown is nuclear, grey is coal. 2020, 2023, 2027, 2030. So last year, renewables, as I said, cheapest in most of the world except Russia and Japan, basically. Renewables only ever getting cheaper, and solar panels getting cheaper faster than wind turbines. And that's why, if nothing else gets in the way at least, solar will be coming to dominate the future. And even without any more policy intervention, as it's called, the model predicts well over half of the world's power supply from solar by 2050. So that one's on the way, and I emphasized how the more electric cars and more cheap batteries would reinforce the transition to renewable electricity, but I just told you that renewable electricity is still getting cheaper. Well, if electricity is just getting cheaper than it's ever been, that's a big incentive to electrify everything, isn't it? Including the cars, so there's a kind of feedback loop that's amplifying there, but actually that clean electricity can be used to do a load of other stuff. Heat pumps, decarbonize heating, make some green hydrogen, as it's called, to make what's called green steel in industry, and so on and so forth. We don't need to get into the detail. The point is there's potential for the tipping. Like in the climate, I told you how the tipping could start in one place in a bad way and then cause another bad tipping point in another place and so on. Here's the counterpunch to that. The tipping can start in one part of the economy, like cars or renewable energy, and tip there, but then that can encourage the tipping in another sector of the economy in a good way. So there's what I call a positive tipping cascade out there to be had, and if you want to read more, you can read our report from a year ago on that. I'll turn my attention briefly to the land, ecology, life, how we eat, things like that, because 75% of the emissions we need to get rid of, they're in the energy sector. They're mostly tied to fossil fuel burning. They'll be, in the future, replaced by renewable power. But what about the other quarter? Where do they come from? They essentially come from how we use or abuse the land and how we choose to feed ourselves. What are we doing, feeding ourselves? We're obviously interacting with the other living things, what the scientists call ecology, if only to get some of them to eat. What do we know about ecology? Well, ecosystems are full of their own feedback loops. Even before we came along, they're full of feedback loops. This is well known to ecologists. It's probably well known to you that sometimes you take what's called a keystone species out of an ecosystem and the whole ecosystem changes. So this poster is about the most famous example of that, Yellowstone National Park. At some point, somebody shot the last wolf in Yellowstone National Park, and that didn't just get rid of the wolves, it changed the whole ecosystem. I mean, the deer went berserk, they ate all the tree saplings, the trees disappeared, the whole caboodle changed completely. Later on, the conservationists got power. They introduced the wolves back, the deer population crashed, the trees came back, everything changed. It's because it's a feedback system already, and when we grow stuff and when we eat stuff, we're trying to interact with those feedback systems, those ecosystems, in a way that we can withdraw some food, obviously. The point here is we could interact with those feedbacks in a smart way to try and get a sustainable, productive food system rather than the kind of dumbass way we do at the moment. So here's an example. I've only got time to give you one. So here's a beautiful ecosystem. This is a blue mussel bed, a natural blue mussel bed, the edible kind of mussel, mule-free kind of mussel. What does the blue mussel do? It stabilizes the muddy sediments of the estuarine, mud flat, salt flat, whatever you want to call it. It generates these beautiful self-organized patterns that tells you it's a feedback system and it's doing its thing. It's creating one state of a system instead of another, but we might like to eat some of these. So how are we going to intervene in a smart way with the feedbacks here? It's quite simple. You could just put a fence in and you give the mussels something to hang on to. Then they start sticking all the sediments together. You get a bigger mussel bed. Then you can sustainably harvest it. Boom. Really noddy technological innovation, but a classic example of working in a simple way with the feedbacks to get a sustainable food system. Why mussels? Well, protein from bivalves, they're called by scientists, way better way of sourcing animal protein than raising cows or pigs or sheep or whatever on the land, which is basically an ecological catastrophe in simple terms. Even though many of us like to eat those different animals, it's a grossly inefficient way of using the land and a massive source of greenhouse gas emissions, etc. We don't need to go, I'm not going to go into all the details. We've tried to apply this thinking in another report just to flesh out some of the potential to have tipping points in food systems, in diet. There's a thing called alternative protein technology that's with us now, and you might be eating some of it without barely noticing it. So there's a lot of potential there. To wrap it up, what I'm trying to get at is you shouldn't feel disempowered by the horror show of the bad climate tipping points, although being someone who studies them day in, day out, it is sobering at the very least. There is something we can do. We have to act, obviously, to change the world, but there are lots of ways we act as consumers, as people who hold a pension that's invested in some things, but could be invested in other things. Maybe we're more politically active than that. I would argue we don't have to go on to prison or go on hunger strike like Lillian and put our life on the line, although some people are choosing to, and I salute them, but I'm not brave enough. Ian and I were chatting about this. Neither of us are of that cut from quite that cloth. But I mean, I salute the people that do, but my point is we've all got some skin in the game, but we've all got what scientists or researchers call some agency in this. I mean, we can all do our little bit. Even if it's just as consumers, we can make choices that could then trigger these reinforcing feedbacks that make the change stronger than our little action. And for some lucky person, they'll be the one who tips the whole system. They'll be the one more person who adopts a new car, electric car, or new technology that triggers everybody else ultimately to follow. So what do we learn? We learn that that's possible, and we learn from the examples, well, yeah, we are civil society, we've got a role to play. But if we think back to, I don't know, AHA, you can use fame and the media to tell a particular different narrative of change and leverage that to create more effective change. Some people have the privilege to do that. If you move the money around, the capital, my word, that makes a big difference. Like taking the money out of coal burning and putting it somewhere else in the UK. My God, that made a difference. And of course, policy is the most powerful lever. If you use policy levers in a smart way, and we can talk about that in the Q&A, that can really bring the tipping point forward, just as it did in Norway, thanks mostly originally to the social activists. But in each of the examples, it's crucial. So if you want to read more and more and more about this stuff, there's lots you could read. You could read our report we released just a month ago at the COP28 meeting on global tipping points, on the bad ones and the good ones. But I'm going to leave it there by just summarizing. I told you a kind of horrible, for me, a kind of horror show story of how we could lose control of climate change. We could be close to triggering climate tipping points that we won't be able to stop. And if we live to regret them, we'll really regret them. And the risk of those just goes up in a non-linear, we say, in a disproportionate way, the more the warming goes up. So we've got a big incentive to do everything in our power to do what's called the Paris Agreement thing of trying to limit global warming well below 2 degrees centigrade is the phrase. My point is that any hope left for that is radical acceleration of social and technological change. But I've tried to cheer you up by showing you not only has that happened in the past, but it's starting to happen again now. And we can all be part of it. Thanks a lot.
Welcome back, everybody. Dozens of questions. I'm afraid we're not going to have time to get through them all, but we'll select a few of them so that Tim can expand on them. We've got a couple of questions here about nuclear. One from Linda Sherwood. She says, can we decarbonise without resorting to nuclear? And Malcolm McGinn asks, do you have a view on the possibility of nuclear fusion becoming a viable proposition for cheap electricity? So, big questions on
big
the nuclear
questions.
front there.
Yeah.
If you can answer that in 30 seconds, Tim.
Yeah,
that'd be
exactly.
great.
Well, nuclear fusion is one of those technologies that stays frustratingly or persistently the same distance in the future, even as time ticks on. So it's always 10 or 20 or whatever years away. So I'm not holding my breath on that one. Nuclear fission, it could have a role in the mix. The big problem with it is it's so expensive. It's the only energy technology or electricity production method in history that has got more expensive over time, and it is pretty much the most expensive way of making power. So there could be a new generation of smaller modular, they're called nuclear reactors, that don't produce weapons-grade material either, which would be a benefit. And they might get cheaper because of those economies of scale. And Bill, what's he name? Oh, tired now. Ex-Microsoft Bill Gates, yeah, he's one of the people who eulogizes about those. You might have seen the film. Oh my God, my brain is afraid my own brain giving the talk to you. But yeah. Okay, there's plenty of enthusiasts for nuclear. We can definitely do it without nuclear. I'm comfortable with nuclear. I trained in physics, but society on average is not very keen on nuclear power, and the economy certainly pricing it out of the mix. So I think it'll be there in the mix to a degree, but it won't be a big part of it. It could be. I'm relaxed either way, but we don't need it. We don't need it because there's lots of ways of storing power.
So your view is we can get 100% of energy from renewables?
We could. Well, we would do it with a lot of storage then, so it would be better to have some base load nuclear. And we will have a bit because we paid for it as a taxpayer in the UK, and other nations have. France obviously still has a lot. So it'll vary the proportion in the mix. You can do it without, but it'll be easier to have some of it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Question from Ros Kelly. Question that you often hear in this debate. She asks, surely electric cars will cause major environmental issues due to the type of raw materials required?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't like to say that they were the perfect technology, and if I had more time, I would talk about could we have a tipping point to driving less? And a good example of where there's been one of those at a city scale would be there's a city called Pontevedra in northwest Spain in Galicia, where the mayor, at the time he came to office, there were 40,000 cars a day coming past his office in the medieval centre of Pontevedra, and there was crime and there was sort of all kinds of negative social consequences. People were living in the centre of the city and everything. They looked at all sorts of ways they could try and control cars. In the end, they thought, nothing viable, we'll just pedestrianise the city centre. And they did it all, not quite overnight, but pretty quickly. And they introduced a whole lot of helpful little maps for how you could walk quickly from one side to the other. Long and the short of it, it's been an enormous roaring success. There's been a large reduction in not just car travel, but emissions for that city. Younger people are flocking back to the city and to live in the inner city. The economy's growing, loads of positives. So I'm all for that kind of stuff. To get back to the question, a lot of people are asking about, okay, what about the cobalt that comes from the mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or the lithium from the mines in Bolivia where water's being robbed from the village downstream? Those are obvious serious environmental, social, local governance issues. But I'd urge everybody, and I'd obviously urge the people who govern those places to regulate the companies and to make sure things are done in the best possible way. But you've got to take a step back and look at the bigger picture as well. So today, how many, what's the size of the extractive industry with fossil fuels and the rest of it? And how many people die from fossil fuel air pollution every year? Anybody know? 5 million people a year worldwide. And tens of thousands of miners die still. So if you look at how much extractive industry is needed for the new green economy, at the most it's a fifth of the size of the current one, and it's probably a tenth of the size. So in total terms, obviously the point is billions of people's lives are on the line with climate change. So yeah, we've got to manage any and try to limit any localized harms from the extraction that is needed for batteries or whatever, but it's tiny compared to the extraction we have at the moment. And you've got to get the scales of justice out. Sorry to say that to you. You'd know more about that than me. But on those scales of justice, there are billions of people on the side of being harmed, arguably now, but certainly in the future, by climate change. Okay, we don't want to add harm, but we're trying to alleviate that enormous harm, and we've got to manage. We don't want to create additional harm. We've got to manage that, but you've got to get the perspective on it.
Got another question from Richard Moulton about the Drax power station and the burning of wood pellets, and related to that, there's the biomass issue and how environmentally friendly the production of electricity by that means is.
I think I am not in favour of Drax, or certainly not in favour of those wood pellets being shipped over from Canada, where astute documentary viewers will have noted that despite what Drax say, it appears that some virgin forest is going into those pellets. So I'm against what they're doing there. I would rather see Drax closed when it can be. And that won't be too far off if we carry on the growth of offshore wind and installing some cheap storage batteries and the rest on the grid. So yeah, it's been a kind of a clumsy and problematic stopgap measure, I think. But there's no real future in large-scale biomass energy as far as I can see. We've done many calculations to look at how much is really viable, and it'll maybe be a modest bit of the mix, but it's almost looks like more trouble than it's worth, doesn't it? Especially if you have what I emphasised, which is this burgeoning cheap solar, cheap wind, cheap storage. So yeah, I think hopefully Drax's days full stop and biomass fueled days are numbered.
Moira Stanley Street asks, and this picks up, I think, from some of the charts that you put up, Tim. How's the UK doing compared to other nations in its goal to achieve a carbon neutral state?
Well, that's a really important question. We have this thing, the Climate Change Act. We hopefully all heard of that, and legally we're bound to try and get to net zero, it's called, greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And we have this independent body, the Climate Change Committee, that has to hold the government to account on its performance. And if you've been watching what they have to say, you'll see regularly they're pointing out the failings or the weaknesses or the problems with current strategy and the current backsliding nonsense that we could all chew over for later, with oil and gas extraction licenses and the rest of it. How are we actually performing? Up to now, we probably hold our heads high as a nation because we've done some amazing things in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. It would depend on which year you took as the baseline as to what percentage you would conclude we'd reduce by, but it's certainly significant. And at the same time, if you didn't know it, we've reduced our power consumption a notable amount in the last 15 years or so, notable being 25 or 30%. I forget the precise figure for where we are in the reduction nationally in greenhouse gas emissions, but I'm going to say it's in the ballpark of also 30%, depending on the baseline year. We've got a lot further to go, and you could argue, I mean, our biggest performance has been in the power sector, where I emphasise the shutting out of coal burning. Basically, of all the major industrialised nations of the world, we've decarbonised by far the fastest, so we should be very proud of that, and we should be celebrating that. We're stalling a bit now with the incumbent regime, if I can call them that. And they have manifestly, for 13, 14 years, failed to get on the next key sectors. So arguably, we tackled the easier stuff. It wasn't easy, but power sector, and we're rapidly tackling, well, we're not as rapidly as we could be tackling mobility, because obviously they've been backsliding on a ban for petrol and diesel car sales, which was idiotic, and even Ford Motor Company told them that they were stupid to do that, but well, that's by the by. But yeah, we could certainly go faster. The incumbents are slowing things down. They'll live to be ashamed of themselves, and history will judge them badly. But we still can hold our head up high that until the backsliding started, we outperformed everybody, and we could still outperform everybody if we got back on it in policy terms. But heating buildings, zero carbon buildings, that goes back to David Cameron's era when they let the 5 major house building companies get together as a lobby and shut down the sort of net zero homes initiative at the time. Absolute disgrace, national disgrace. And now we're trying to claw back action in that sector, faced with a lot of bad faith because of that history. So, yeah, it's just a salutary tale in whatever you want to call it, but a salutary tale in poor governance. But we had a triumphant era, and we could have a triumphant era again.
Thank you. We've got a roving mic in the room, so if anybody got any questions, put that. See, there's a few upstairs. We've got a mic upstairs. Can I have this chap on my right, your left, please?
Hello. You made very little reference in your presentation regarding the impact of vast population growth on climate change. Can you tell me where you stand on that issue, please?
I can. I have to say, thank you. That question, by the way, always comes up, so I'm well prepared for that. So couple of things to say about population growth. 2 important things. One, it's not been the most important driver of increasing greenhouse gas emissions. It's obviously been a contributor, but far from the most important one. The most important driver has been increasing per capita emissions or per capita consumption. By far the most important driver. And then what else to say about population growth? Well, it's almost impossible to stop it going to roughly 9 billion in 2050 because the current age distribution, as the demographers would call it, is skewed to the young. In other words, the people who are currently young only have to get older and have 2 kids per couple for us to go from wherever we are at 8 billion to 9 billion. It's just filling out a sort of even age distribution. So beyond that, what I would say is the one of the most positive tipping points, arguably, that's happened and could continue to happen is the more empowerment of women, education for women, access to family planning, contraception, etc., that there is in the world, the faster we'll see the peaking of population and then its long-term decline. And I think you had Guy Vince probably talking eloquently about this a few months ago. So we will go, or at least there's a very good chance we can go in through that peak that's almost impossible to avoid, and then see the population merrily declining later this century. But there's very little we can do about the peak, and there's a great deal we can do about per capita consumption, especially the richer, higher consuming people. So that's what I have to say on that. Let's by all means do everything we can to increase the empowerment of women across the world, and that will be the thing that determines the future population. But if we want to tackle climate change, let's tackle overconsumption by the rich.
Have we got any questions from the floor downstairs? This chap here.
What is the potential for onshore wind?
Onshore?
Yeah.
Off or on?
Oh, onshore, well, on dry land and not
Onshore.
in the sea.
Onshore.
Oh, yeah, so considerable if people embrace it, and not considerable if people resist it, I think, onshore wind. So the way it's played in the UK, as we can all observe, is we were having burgeoning onshore wind, but there was a lot of counter-reaction to that, and that slowed down the whole expansion. it became clear to the then government that offshore wind would be less socially disruptive, and although it was more expensive at the time, it had the potential to become competitive in price, because although it's going to cost more to sort of install offshore and install some extra grid, generally the wind blows stronger and more consistently offshore. And that's the way it's played out. We've turned away from onshore wind in the UK because too much social objection to it. And we've gone offshore, and that's growing exponentially. Other nations, it looks different. In Denmark, right from the start, the people profited from onshore wind. I mean, literally, it was people's cooperatives that owned the onshore wind turbines to begin with, and then it would be whole villages that owned them through the 1980s as wind power is growing fastest there, ahead of the rest of the world. By the time it got to the 1990s, the turbines got so big, no single town even could perhaps own the whole new wind farm. The law mandated in Denmark that a minimum 20% of the profits would go to the people, of the local people, as for some defined region, for any wind program. And surprise, surprise, the people were wildly enthusiastic about onshore wind in Denmark and have profited handsomely from it. So I think that's a lesson in good governance from the Danes.
Very interesting. Got one here from Gordon Woodcock. Please comment on Professor Ian Plimmer's view of CO2 is only 0.04% of the atmosphere, and humans are responsible for 3% of that 0.04%. If that makes sense.
His numbers are a bit off, so in that sense. So,
well, I can't verify it, but
yeah,
that's what he put on this question.
CO2, so carbon dioxide, the so-called pre-industrial level, 280 parts in a million. What are we at today? So one of you in the audience will probably have looked more recently than I have, and I'll have a better, more precise number. We're over 400. Are we at 420 something at the moment? I forget it. It's been a long day. So we haven't doubled it yet. We have increased it a bit over 50%. I guess I don't know. I don't really follow the climate skeptics or whatever you want to call them too closely, although I have a lot in my inbox. What can I say? I mean, it's 19th century physics that it acts as a so-called greenhouse gas, that these are molecules that capture radiation, the heat radiation coming off the Earth, that causes the molecule to vibrate, quantum physics this is, and then it will re-emit the radiation. Some of it will go up, some of it will go sideways, and some of it comes back down again. But the stuff that comes back down again is an extra source of heating to the surface, hence global warming, hence what we call the greenhouse effect. End of discussion, that is real. How big is it? How much warming does it cause? Well, yeah, it gets a bit more sophisticated than that, but by 1896, a famous chemist, Svante Arrhenius, had calculated that if we doubled the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere, it would get about, his calculations said about 4.5 or 5 degrees centigrade warmer. About 120 something years on, and that's still in the range of our estimates, minimum 2 degrees warmer, maybe 5 degrees warmer. Why is that uncertain? Because of a load of these feedbacks in the climate, like the Arctic ice melt and the stuff I talked about. But I don't know what else to say, really. That's 19th century physics. We shouldn't be arguing about it. Let's talk about what the consequences are and whether we think that they're a big enough threat that we ought to do something about it. My argument is yes and yes.
Thanks. Jeff Tucker asked a number of things, including, can you expand on other energy sources such as hydrogen in domestic and industrial heavy transport sectors?
Absolutely.
Where he says, posits that clearly battery is part of the solution, but not exclusively so.
Totally, yeah, brilliant question. So I kind of got into electricity and renewables, and by the time we'd added up that and mobility, like electric vehicles, we might have tackled something like a third of the greenhouse gas emissions. maybe a bit more. But then you're starting to look, okay, you can electrify some other stuff that causes emissions, but at some point you get to processes or activities that need high energy density, it's called, or that need, you're trying to move a very big mass, or you're trying to move it a long way, or you need a lot of thrust for an aeroplane or something like this. And then you're finding, or you want to make iron or steel, you need a lot of heat. Then you're finding it's hard to get a purely electric solution. You just, or a battery storage solution, you just can't generate enough thrust or enough heat. And then, yeah, you need a chemical fuel, and green hydrogen, as it's called. You make hydrogen by using renewable electricity to split water. That'll be this crucial fuel of the future, both in the form of hydrogen and in the form of ammonia, NH3, also a good energy carrier. Hydrogen, wonderful stuff. 3 times higher energy density than petroleum. So amazing energy density, just quite voluminous, hard to get into liquid form. You have to cool it down a lot or compress it a lot. Ammonia, important because although it doesn't have the same energy density, you don't need to cool it much or pressurize it much to get it into a liquid, and you can run something like it's the equivalent of a diesel engine off ammonia. So both of those things, hydrogen and ammonia from splitting water, super important for the future. Glad you asked, because we look at a sector like steel production, 7% of greenhouse gas emissions, but we could do it all off hydrogen and electricity. You make the green hydrogen from splitting the water, then you do something called direct ion reduction, sort of a kind of chemistry that turns the ore into the kind of iron you can then use to make steel. And then you use something called an electric arc furnace powered by renewable energy, and that can make you all the steel you want with renewable electricity. Boom, fantastic. But hydrogen or ammonia, brilliant, chemical energy carriers. So now it's a way of storing the renewable energy, right? And if the sun shines more in Africa than in Europe, maybe Africa has a great future making the green hydrogen or the green ammonia and piping or shipping it to us, as to even out, those times in the winter where the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing and we still need a power source. And sounds like the questioner knows their stuff, because already Germany has a deal with Morocco for a 100 megawatt green hydrogen production facility. The European Union has struck a load of deals with African countries and other countries. This is kicking off right now. We probably aren't very aware of it because our media don't choose to talk about it a lot. But this is perhaps the next big tipping point. Can we get to that point where basically the green hydrogen, the green ammonia is cost competitive fuel? And the latest projections are saying, wow, this is really going, and by 2030, those could be cost competitive, and we could have this. It will have an explosion in a new kind of fuel economy. People sometimes foolishly describe it as like the new oil, but that's a bad choice of comparator for a lot of reasons. But yeah, it's a fantastic question, because that's going to be a key part of the future of decarbonising everything.
Should we go back to the mics? There's quite a few questions. Hands went up upstairs. Chap in the middle, please.
Good evening. Can I go back on a point that you made a few minutes ago? Is there any correlation between, you said that England or the UK is doing really well in terms of reducing its emissions. Is there any correlation between that and the fact that, and this is not a political point I'm trying to make, the fact that we no longer, the manufacturing industries are rapidly reducing, or we're subsidising firms like Tata to take their production to another country in the world to cause them problems?
Well, that's a great question. You're definitely right that you've got to calculate emissions, also what in the lingo is called scope 3, so what, and ones that you might have outsourced to production elsewhere. So I've looked at that data, others have looked at it. Even when you count in all the rubbish and tat and whatever we're buying from wherever, we're still managing to reduce emissions. And we are pretty much one of the few, or if not the only major economy that's achieving it, that's decoupling GDP growth from emissions and managing to still grow GDP in a wibbly-wobbly way whilst decreasing emissions. But we even are on that count. But you're right as well. There are some things that made it easier for us to shut down coal burning for electricity production. Namely, Margaret Thatcher had already shut the coal industry down in the 1980s with all due social consequences. And that has been a major contributor to our reduction in emissions, just the power sector. So yeah, there's reasons. There are many reasons why we've achieved what we've achieved, and you wouldn't necessarily judge all of those reasons to be wholly good. But at the same time, we should be proud of the Climate Change Act, and it definitely has played a decisive role, for example, in the now over 40% of renewable power we have. We can directly tie the Climate Change Act to a number of policies that incentivised offshore wind in a way that's caused this incredible decline in price and an explosion in scale of that. That all kicked off as soon as the Climate Change Act was passed. The then government stared at what they were doing and realised, my God, we've really got to incentivise offshore wind. They doubled the credits compared to onshore wind, solar, and everything else. If you developed offshore, they changed the financing mechanisms. They really supported what has become this exponential growth story. So, like everything in this glorious nation, it's a pretty mixed bag.
Question from downstairs on the mic, if you would.
In your relatively optimistic picture of the future, I noticed that you used an illustration referring back to the suffragette movement, which referred to a change in our political system. Are you seriously arguing that your optimistic future can be delivered by our existing national and international methods of governance, our political system, and our current capitalist market economy?
I'm with the questioner. No, I'm not optimistic that the neoliberal version of capitalism is going to get us out of the problem it got us into. That would be unlikely in my view. So but I'm enthusiastic about evidence, some evidence at least, for increasing what's called deliberative and participatory democracy, by which I mean I'm particularly interested in what's called participatory budgeting, which started life in a southern Brazilian city, Porto Alegre, where they gave the people the power to determine how their taxes, or a chunk of their taxes, were spent on public works. And very quickly it came to a situation where the people were voting to raise taxes because they were all in favour and encouraged by what they saw when they saw how the choices they made about how their own money was spent were benefiting them. And that was a truly bottom-up system, by the way, because the sub-regions of the city, which incidentally has about 1.5 million people in it, it's not small, were given an element of control in the city-wide budget. Now, this then spread to many thousands of cities by this count worldwide. It certainly spread through Brazil first. There are cases in Africa where this participatory budgeting is giving cities in Madagascar of exercising power over mining companies to make them pay their taxes that they hadn't been paying. In other country cases, the people have adjusted it by choice in a way that basically redistributes money. It penalises, say, parts of a city where there's more tax evasion and rewards those where there's less. There's stuff like this is happening out there. I'm not saying it's gone to large scale yet, but I'm obviously very interested in these things. I think it has huge potential. We can all agree that there's a collective disillusionment with democracy going on, especially in younger people. We can also look at the evidence that, whatever you want to think of it, that populism in the broadest sense has increased in all the polls, has increased certainly in the first few years that you get populists in power. It increases 20%, at least by 20%, population satisfaction with government. But populism doesn't have to just mean the nasty kind. It can also mean these forms of deliberative and participatory democracy. At least that's the flavour I favour. So yeah, I'm 100% with you. I think ultimately, there's no way that the worst, what I'd call the worst neoliberal forms of capitalism can get us out of trouble. I think they're in trouble anyway, and it won't, okay, they managed to ride out the global financial crisis, and they've just about sort of rode through the pandemic, but there'll be more shocks coming, and at some point there'll be a shock that they mismanage, and the popular discontent will be such that it'll force political change, is my personal guess.
Jan Ferguson asks a question on a similar vein about whether there's any hope under a capitalist system, but also asks a question about whether there's any hope where we're constantly striving for growth.
Yeah,
which
great.
isn't specifically related to
It is
capitalism,
great.
of course.
So,
but very interesting.
what I want to
important
also
point.
emphasise is that I walk a delicate tightrope. In my view, those things will change, but it's not a brilliant strategy to go in saying, right, we've got to change everything, change the paradigm, throw everything out, start afresh. Because I've been saying that for 50 years, well, not quite, and other people certainly have been, and that hasn't got us anywhere. So what I was trying to convey in my talk was, you've got to work from the place you are in the system you're in, but there's smart ways of working from where we are to start to accelerate change away from the trajectory we're on. And there's actually ways of kind of, you could say it's tricking or leveraging was the language that a famous systems thinker called Donella Meadows used, leveraging the current system into a new direction. And that's what I was trying to convey with the stories about solar panels or wind turbines. Because the reason solar panels are cheap is partly because of capitalism. It's partly because of 5 solar startup companies in China floating on the US stock exchange. But it's also very much to do with supportive policy in Germany, creating a niche for those panels to be sold and to upscale the technology. So there's a pluralism to the world. But we could actually leverage some of the vestiges of capitalism and the kind of what I think of as slightly distasteful enthusiasm for making money that lurks in the City of London and elsewhere to make a hell of a lot in the transition to renewables. I would look at the end goal and the great, and not let the perfect be the enemy of the good there. But then I would say, I'm totally with the questioner. You can't grow indefinitely on a finite planet. That's been said repeatedly since before I was born. It hasn't quite got through to all the corridors of power yet, but you don't need a PhD or a professorship like me to see the truth in that. So what we've got to navigate is sort of work with this monster that we have to try and accelerate to some cleaner technologies. But my possibly naive view on it is we then open up the space to ask the deeper questions and address the bigger stuff, which is why the hell are we measuring progress, quote unquote, with an idiotic measure like GDP, which goes up when there's more crime and more people in prison and all sorts of social pathologies. But we can get there, and I think as soon as we start shaking the foundations, then everything else will start to not crumble, but start to be re-examined. By which I mean, picture this renewable energy future. Solar power's everywhere. Where's oil? It's in the ground in a few states with, like Saudi Arabia, with very, very, to put it politely, very dodgy human rights records, etc. Power is very much concentrated. Literal oil power is very much concentrated politically. Solar, where's the greatest solar potential? It's kind of everywhere, but it's particularly in for some of the poorest people in the global south. So geopolitics and power is going to be totally restructured. The balance of payments of countries is going to change radically in the positive for those the 80% of people on the planet who live in a country that is a net importer of fossil fuels. Everything's going to radically change here. And that'll be great because we'll get to all the good and the hard stuff, like changing our political systems and getting rid of the nonsensical idea that we can keep with this crazy ideology of indefinite growth. But hopefully realise that we live on a planet that's hosted 4 billion light years of life flourishing by just recycling all the stuff it needs to make new stuff and powering itself with sustainable energy. Happy days. What's not to like? There's no net growth of the biosphere, but it's doing great.
A lot of what you said this evening, Tim, is about public policy and political decision making, and on that vein, Tricia Melling asks, what do you think about Labour's proposed green strategy?
Well, you probably read more about it than I have, because I've been disillusioned since I was a teenager by the mainstream parties, if I'm honest with you. But what I've seen about Labour's plans are certainly a step in the right direction. I get the sense, from what little I've picked up, that they will create a substantial government department that really grapples with this complex intertwined thing of tackling climate change, energy supply, and hopefully social justice with it. So I hope that they've grasped basically the concept of a Green New Deal, and will try to execute on that. I'll look forward to you telling me more about it afterwards, and maybe I'll go and read more, but I don't also hold out a great deal of hope, principally because I'm 50 years old and I've watched the Labour Party just imitate in the sort of neoliberal ideology of the Conservative Party during my life. That's my personal position. So I think it'll be a step in the right direction. It won't, and I hope they go as far as they can. But it comes back to the popular mandate, doesn't it? I think it's down to us, the people and the voters, to give them a stronger mandate, and then they'll be more courageous, is what I would hope. Yeah. But will we do that? And that's a sort of feedback loop between us and them, I think. Can they gain a confidence in their electorate? The electorate will vote for them and with them in doing a more decisive Green New Deal. I hope so. But how are we going to signal that to them? Well, I'm signalling my views tonight. We'll all signal our views at the ballot box. But I think they're wavering, is what I pick up. But they're only wavering because there are some people shout louder than others. And unfortunately, some of the people who shout the loudest are the sort of, they get too much due attention.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Tim Lenton. It's been a very interesting and informative evening.
Ian.
We're all going to go away with lots of things to think about, and obviously it's an issue most of us have given a great deal of thought to over recent years, but we can perhaps have a more informed discussion amongst ourselves as a result of what you've had to say. So thank you very much, Professor Tim.
Yeah. Thank you.